1, 2. It'll be red. Your mic will be hot.
The Subcommittee on Capital Markets will now come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. And this hearing is entitled, A Roadmap for Growth, Reforms to Encourage Capital Formation and Investment Opportunities for All Americans. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the Chair for inclusion in the record. I would now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. First, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. It was a pleasure to meet you all prior to this hearing. As we bring our 4-part capital formation series to a close, as I outlined in the previous 3 hearings, I have held small businesses are the absolute backbone of our economy, and we must ensure that our markets are working efficiently and effectively to provide companies access to the capital that they need to innovate, to grow, and to create jobs. To accomplish that goal, we must also ensure a regulatory framework that is streamlined and not overly burdensome. As we've heard throughout our capital formation hearings, a framework that fails to, I'll say, right-size regulation will stifle innovation. It will limit wealth-creating opportunities for investors and prevent small businesses from reaching their potential. Over the past several months, we have had the opportunity to hear from a range of experts and stakeholders on the ways in which Congress can help promote economic growth and investment. At our first hearing, we heard how our private markets have been reserved for the wealthiest Americans. Our witnesses also shared insights into the challenges that entrepreneurs face when raising capital and identified some of the senseless regulations that limit their pool of investors. Their testimony proved the need for common sense reforms that expand wealth-creating opportunities to Americans who have effectively been relegated to the sidelines. Our second hearing explored the critical role of small businesses and entrepreneurs in driving economic growth and job creation in the United States. We discussed several ways to reduce obstacles, and our witnesses identified policies to promote capital formation for small businesses across the country. From this discussion, it became clear Congress must do more to enhance the ways in which small businesses raise capital in our markets. At our third hearing, we focused on the role of public markets in promoting economic growth and investment. We found that many companies are delaying their initial public offerings, IPOs, or remaining private to avoid unreasonable regulatory and disclosure obligations. Witnesses also discussed their concerns with declining IPOs, a reduction in the number of publicly traded companies, and the impact of these trends on investors and, I'd say, the broader economy. Their testimony underscored the need for proposals that, again, right-size regulation, making public markets more attractive without compromising investor protection. As we begin our final hearing, it is clear that these issues are deeply interconnected. Expanding investment opportunities for all Americans, improving access to capital for small businesses, and strengthening our public markets are all critical components of a healthy and vibrant economy. As we look ahead, there is much work to be done to ensure that our capital markets are functioning efficiently and effectively for all Americans. This includes supporting policies that promote investment, encourage innovation, and remove unnecessary regulatory burdens. Thank you again to my colleagues and today's witnesses for joining us in this important undertaking. Your insights and contributions are invaluable, and I think we all look forward to today's discussion. I am now pleased to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Sherman, of the Subcommittee on Capital Markets, our gentleman from California, for 4 minutes for an opening statement. Ms. Sherman.
This is our 4th subcommittee hearing on the most important thing that financial institutions and capital markets do, which is provide capital for businesses, particularly small, medium-sized, and growing businesses. Most mainstream businesses turn to banks for loans, and they're increasingly not getting those loans. because our system, presided over by the regulators and this committee, is tilted against banks making business loans. We saw Silicon Valley Bank, they didn't go bad because they made bad business loans. They went under because of their bad bond investments. So what are the problems? First, credit unions face severe and unjustified limits on making any business loans at all. Second, the CECL accounting system brutally and unjustifiably penalizes any bank that does make a business loan. If a bank creates a portfolio of business loans by making highly profitable, very secure business loans, it must still list those loans on their balance sheet at less than par. Third, the rival to making business loans for a bank is investing in securities, chiefly bonds, and our system rewards banks by a bizarre accounting system. If they list these bonds as held to maturity and the bonds happen to go down in value, well, heads I win, tails no bet. You can still list those bonds on the balance sheet at par, even though they aren't worth par. But if the bonds go up in value, the bank simply sells one group of bonds, replaces them with another group of bonds, and puts the gain right there on the balance sheet. Finally, we have a system where business development companies are unduly penalized by the SEC because those mutual funds that invest in BDCs are penalized by having to show a wrongful overstatement of their costs. And that's why, Madam Chairman, I'm glad you've included in the bills we're considering, the bill I introduced along with Representative Huizinga, to change this bias. So the other avenues for businesses to get capital are partially foreclosed by unjustified laws. So businesses will often turn to private placements. Critical to a private placement is the definition of accredited investor. I agree with the majority that our current definition is unfair and illogical. It should be replaced by a definition that does two things. First, don't allow a private placement in which any individual accredited investor is putting more than 5 or perhaps 10% of their net worth in any one offering, or more than 50% of their net worth in all private offerings. Second, make sure that that accredited investor has expertise or has truly independent advisors that have the expertise to evaluate the investment. I agree with the majority that simply saying somebody has $1 million in net worth, therefore they're accredited, is unfair to those who don't have $1 million in net worth and ridiculously complimentary to assume that anybody with $1 million is sophisticated and knowledgeable. Finally, in defining the difference between a public and a private company, Congress set the limit at a very generous 2,000 shareholders. But the SEC, in counting shareholders, uses a funny math in which you can have thousands and thousands of shareholders and still be under the 2,000 limit. And we'll explore that during my question time. I yield back.
Today, we welcome the testimony of Brandon Brooks. Mr. Brooks is a founding partner at Overlooked Ventures, a venture capital fund investing in historically overlooked founders. Additionally, he is the founder of Zinsu. I think I've got that right. Yes, Zinsu, a platform to increase efficiency in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Prior to Zinsu and Overlooked Ventures, he started the first Black-owned crowdfunding platform in the U.S., Inventrify. Next, we have Rodney Sampson. Mr. Sampson serves as the executive chairman and CEO of Opportunity Hub, which he founded in 2013 in Atlanta, Georgia. Today, Opportunity Hub is a business and foundation with an ecosystem building venture fund. It is a leading technology startup and venture ecosystem building platform created to ensure that everyone has equitable access to the future of work. Next, we have Joel Trotter. Mr. Trotter is the co-chairman of Latham and Watkins National Office, a central resource for clients and Latham lawyers facing complex issues arising under the U.S. securities laws. Mr. Trotter was a leading member of the IPO task force and served as a principal author of the IPO-related provisions of the Jobs Act in 2012. Next, we have Mr. Henry Ward. Mr. Ward is the co-founder and CEO of Carta, an organization that helps issuers, investors, and employees manage and value equity ownership from idea to IPO. Carta is trusted by more than 30,000 companies, over 5,000 investment funds, and 500,000 employees for cap table management, compensation management, liquidity venture capital solutions, and more. Carta's liquidity solutions have returned $13 billion to shareholders in secondary transactions. Last but not least, we have Melanie Lubin. Commissioner Lubin was appointed in 1998 by the Maryland Attorney General as the Maryland Securities Commissioner for the Securities Division. In September of 2021, Ms. Lubin began her one-year term as the 104th President of the North American Securities Administrators Association, the oldest international organization devoted to investor protection and responsible capital formation. I want to thank each of you for taking the time to be here. Each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Without objection, each of your written statements will be made part of the record. Mr. Brooks, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for your oral remarks.
Thank you. Good afternoon, esteemed members of the House Financial Services Committee. I stand before you today as a representative of the voiceless and marginalized, the overlooked and the underestimated. I stand before you to speak on behalf of the forgotten founders who were never given a chance to showcase their potential, and the hardworking people who are being shut out of investment opportunities because they don't belong to the elite class of the wealthy. Today I bring a message of hope and a call to action. The time has come to break down the barriers that have held back our economy and empower the next wave of American innovation. The time has come to put the American dream back within reach of all those who seek it. It's time for IPO reform, support for overlooked founders, and safer investment opportunities for non-wealthy investors. And if you don't act now, the consequences will be dire. The American dream will become nothing but a distant memory, and the economic gap between the haves and the have-nots will grow wider than ever before. But together we can make a change. Together we can create a better future for all Americans. Thank you for your attention. According to a report by the National Venture Capital Association, the number of IPOs has declined by more than 38% since 2014. This decline is troubling because IPOs provide a critical source of capital for companies to grow and expand. By going public, companies can access a larger pool of investors and raise the capital they need to expand into new products, hire more employees, and expand into new markets. But going public is a daunting process for many companies, especially the smaller ones. It's expensive, time-consuming, and comes with a host of regulatory requirements that can be overwhelming. That's why we need to make it easier and more attractive for companies to go public. The reality is that many talented entrepreneurs don't have access to the resources and networks they need to start and grow successful companies. Women, Black founders, and people who exist outside the lines of the traditional startup ecosystem in particular face significant barriers when it comes to accessing capital and building the networks that are necessary for success. To address this, we need to create more opportunities for overlooked founders to access capital and build networks. Finally, we need to make it easier for everyday Americans to invest in the future of our economy. The reality is that most Americans are excluded from investing in early-stage companies because they simply don't have the financial resources to do so. To address this, we need to create more opportunities for non-wealthy investors to invest in early-stage companies. In conclusion, we are at a crucial moment in our nation's history. The old rules no longer work, and the status quo is holding us back. But we have an opportunity to chart a new course, one that empowers overlooked founders, opens up investment opportunities to all, and drives economic growth for all Americans. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But if we have the courage to act, we can create a future that is more just, more prosperous, and more equitable for all. Bless you, and thank you all.
Very kind of you, Mr. Brooks. Thank you. Mr. Sampson, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give your oral remarks.
Good afternoon. Chair Wagner, Ranking Member Sherman, and members of this subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'm humbled to have my wife, Shanteria Austin Sampson, and our children here with us as well. Today, I am here as a pioneer and stakeholder in our nation's Black technology startup and venture ecosystem, an ecosystem that I have been a part of building from the ground up as a founder, investor, and ecosystem builder for nearly 23 years, and in the last decade as the co-founder, executive chairman, and CEO of Opportunity Hub, the nation's leading innovation, entrepreneurship, and investment ecosystem building organization created to ensure that everyone, everywhere, has equitable opportunities in the fourth industrial revolution and beyond as a path to creating new multi-generational wealth with no reliance on pre-existing multi-generational wealth. 23 years ago, I co-founded my first technology startup company in Atlanta, Georgia. This was my first introduction to the venture capital and angel investing ecosystem. And I learned very fast that access to early stage private capital in America was not equal. In our era, there were only 3 Black technology founders that had raised millions in venture capital for their startups. Omar Wasso at blackplanet.com, Clarence Wooten at imagecafe.com, and myself at Multicast Media Technologies and streamingfaith.com. As a note of outcome, all 3 of our companies were successfully acquired. In 2021, Harlem Capital reported that less than 1,000 Black and Hispanic startups have ever raised over $1 million in angel and venture capital in American history. When juxtaposed to over 15 startup investments consummated in 2021 and again in 2022, according to PitchBook and the National Venture Capital Association, the amount of capital invested in socially and economically disadvantaged individuals that have experienced institutional, personal, and interpersonal racism, discrimination, and bias in the American startup ecosystem is dismal, negligible, and shameful. In my 2021 report entitled Building Racial Equity in Tech Ecosystems to Spur Local Recovery, published by the Brookings Institution, where I serve as a non-resident senior fellow, I point out that approximately $26 billion annually should be going to the Black technology startup and venture ecosystem to build tech hubs in hundreds of American cities, to rapidly upskill millions for existing software, sales, cyber, new energy, and AI technology careers, incubate thousands of new high-growth ventures leveraging edge technologies, and back them with the early startup capital to hire, build, go-to-market, sell, and grow. Ecosystem orgs like OHub, venture capital firms like 100 Black Angels and Allies Fund, and angel investors like my wife and I are exhausted from asking the existing private markets to invest in the thousands of brilliant Black technologists, operators, and founders that are part of our growing ecosystem. Outside of the performative pitch competitions and diversity announcements of 2020, no consistent private commitment exists to fund Black-founded early-stage startups, venture funds, tech hubs, incubators, accelerators, upskilling schools, and ecosystem-building organizations at scale. The current relevant public sector commitments like the State Small Business Credit Initiative, EDA's Build Back Better Regional Challenge, Regional Tech Hubs, and NSF Engines and CHIPS and Science Act are very exciting for overall global American innovative competitiveness, yet there's little hope in the Black technology startup and venture ecosystem that this funding will actually make it to America's overlooked and underinvested communities with any sizable traction or scale. The Black tech ecosystem has started to innovate from within. When possible, we invest in each other's companies and initiatives. OHUB created the Black Technology Ecosystem Investment Certificate in collaboration with UNC, Duke, Stanford, and the Links Incorporated. To date, nearly 50 Black affluent and accredited men and allies have been certified. Imagine this certificate in collaboration with FINRA as a path towards accreditation. In closing, I would like to thank you for your time. If we do not get on the capitalization tables of these startups that are transforming society as we meet today, we will have future generations in America of haves and have-nevers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sampson. Mr. Trotter, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give your oral remarks.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Chairman Wagner and Ranking Member Sherman, members of the subcommittee. It's a pleasure to be here today, appearing before you. Based on my experience as part of the IPO task force leadership, I'm pleased to share my perspectives on reforms to encourage capital formation and investment opportunities. The Jobs Act of 2012 is a bipartisan success story and a model for innovative solutions you're now considering. By an overwhelming bipartisan majority, Congress enacted the IPO Task Force on-ramp proposal as Title I of the Jobs Act. And 11 years ago this month, President Obama signed it into law. Title I has been called the most successful title in the Jobs Act, and academic research has demonstrated that the on-ramp provisions significantly increased IPO volume overall. We should encourage more IPO activity. The research of the IPO task force showed that companies that go public experience more than 90% of their job growth after their IPO. Today, however, public companies face a higher compliance burden than ever before, and the SEC has formally acknowledged that when its rules increase the cost of being a public company, that discourages some companies from accessing the public markets. For this reason, the Jobs Act offers an important lesson, a series of lessons, for successful bipartisan legislation. I will highlight 4 of these lessons. First, find small changes that will have a big impact. The IPO on-ramp comprised multiple small changes that had an outsized impact. Together, these changes streamlined the IPO process and made it easier to transition to public company status. Second, use a balanced approach that scales the regulatory burden to a company's size and maturity. The IPO on-ramp concept allowed the regulatory burden to scale to the size of the company, a simple but powerful concept borrowed from SEC rules. In the debate over more versus less regulation, this is a compelling way forward. Rather than more versus less securities regulation, balanced regulation that scales over time. This approach encourages IPO activity while maintaining the existing and continuously increasing level of securities regulation for mature public companies. Third, remember that the innovations under consideration will not reduce the demanding and rigorous liability provisions of the federal securities laws. The Jobs Act changed none of the robust anti-fraud provisions of the federal securities laws. This is of paramount importance in understanding the limited nature of the changes. There's a long list of liability provisions and compliance obligations that apply to all public companies. They are extensive and rigorous, and they will remain undiminished by any of the proposals before you. Fourth, use self-executing statutory text that will become immediately effective and will not burden an already busy agency. The IPO on-ramp statutory text was self-executing rather than relying on SEC rulemaking. In this regard, the Jobs Act is a study in contrasts. As I sat in the Rose Garden on April the 5th, 2012, I watched the IPO on-ramp provisions become effective at the moment President Obama signed them into law. In contrast, other provisions of the Jobs Act required SEC rulemaking by specified deadlines, none of which were met. The Dodd-Frank Act of 2010 presents a similar dichotomy. The self-executing provisions were immediately effective, whereas the Dodd-Frank mandate for an executive compensation clawback rule will have taken 13 years to implement when the final rules become effective later this year. You have the ability, the opportunity, to build on the success of Title I of the Jobs Act and the lessons it offers us today. Given the direct connection between capital formation and job creation, that opportunity is compelling. I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Trotter. Now, Mr. Ward, you are recognized for 5 minutes to give your oral remarks.
Chair Wagner, Ranking Member Sherman, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to be here. My name is Henry Ward, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Carta, a financial technology company that sits at the center of the innovation economy. I'm proud to be here today as an advocate for the venture ecosystem, for the entrepreneurs who have an idea, for the startups they create, for the investors who support them, and for the employees who build for them. Startups are America's innovation engine, and it is this venture ecosystem that allowed us to build Carta. We started Carta with the vision of connecting startups with their investors and employees by lowering barriers for companies to issue and manage equity. We launched our product in January of 2014 with 7 employees. Our first customer paid us $120. As an entrepreneur, you never forget the first time someone paid you for something you built. Today, we're 2,000 employees across 9 offices with $300 million in revenue. We continue to grow by supporting the founders that start companies and the investors that back them. I understand the words venture capital may not elicit the most positive response today, but I'm here to remind us why entrepreneurs and the ecosystem that support them are vital to America's growth story and leadership in the world. And allow me to explain why. First, the venture ecosystem drives innovation and growth. Most of our innovative companies have been backed by venture. Apple was venture-backed, Uber was venture-backed, Amazon was venture-backed, Moderna was venture-backed. We take for granted what venture does for America's innovation and how it has transformed our lives. So much of the technology we use today is a direct product of startups and venture capital. America has driven every major technological innovation in the last 30 years. Not China, not Russia, not Europe, not Asia. It is one of the most important ways we lead the world. And most of that innovation has come out of the venture ecosystem, and we must not take that ecosystem for granted. Second, we can make the venture model work better. Innovation requires time to build, experiment, and scale. Uncertainty and volatility is inherent in building something new. The private markets provide patient capital with a tolerance for risk that allows entrepreneurs to transform concepts into companies. This is the innovation engine of America, and it should not be limited to coastal regions. It should be accessible to more. Much of the criticism of venture, the concentration, lack of diversity, exclusivity, are largely reflective of the private market regulatory framework. Let me give you 2 examples of why. First, the primary avenue to raise capital requires entrepreneurs to have a, quote, pre-existing relationship with an investor. This rewards those who are in the club and excludes those who are not. It creates a slanted system where it isn't what you know, but who you know. Second, the accredited investor definition limits investing to the wealthy. This rule, coupled with the pre-existing relationship rule, makes things worse. It limits access to not just people you know, but only the rich people you know. If we want to democratize access to America's growth engine, we should take a hard look at this framework. Third and last, A thriving venture ecosystem is the future of public markets. A growing criticism is that private companies take too long to go public and that regulations should push companies public earlier. This is not a good idea for the company, the employees, the investors, or the public markets. Every entrepreneur dreams of building a company that goes public. When companies wait to go public, it is not because they don't want to. They wait because they are not ready to. Public markets have changed. Companies that went public 20 years ago could not go public today. The expectations for scale, quarterly predictability, resiliency of business model, and financial means have grown. For companies that have achieved this level of maturity, the public markets are a wonderful place. But for companies that have not, the public markets are unforgiving. We saw this recently with the SPAC craze, where many private companies were taken public prematurely. Those companies, employees, and investors were severely punished, and they are now picking up the pieces. The answer to creating more public companies is not to make private markets more hostile, but to make private markets work better. Doing so makes it easier to start companies, nurture their growth, and create the pipeline of tomorrow's great public companies. And that is why I'm here today, to advocate for your involvement in creating a better framework for private markets and America's innovation economy. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ward. Commissioner Lubin, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give your oral remarks.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Wagner, Ranking Member Sherman, and distinguished members of this subcommittee. I am Melanie Lubin. I'm a 36-year veteran of the Division of Securities within Maryland's Office of the Attorney General and of NASAA, the North American Securities Administrators Association. Last year, I served as NASAA's president. Since 2015, I have also served as NASAA's non-voting representative to the Financial Stability Oversight Council. State securities regulators play several vital roles in responsible capital formation. For example, many of our regulators support the business community by working with local organizations to conduct seminars for small businesses, by responding regularly to capital raising inquiries, and by maintaining websites devoted to capital formation resources. We also protect and educate investors working to build secure financial futures. At the end of the day, our work helps to ensure the integrity and efficiency of the capital markets that power our economy. Today, we are examining legislation that is intended to help entrepreneurs and small businesses to increase opportunities for investors and to strengthen public markets. NASAA supports these laudable goals. Unfortunately, we respectfully submit that many of the proposals under discussion today are counterproductive to our collective efforts to achieve these goals. In particular, we urge Congress to reject proposals that would take away certain long-standing state authorities to promote responsible capital formation, including the Small Entrepreneurs Empowerment and Development Act, or SEED Act, the Improving Crowdfunding Opportunities Act, the Restoring the Secondary Trading Market Act, and the Unlocking Capital for Small Businesses Act. If these preemption bills were to become law, state governments likely would reduce funding for the great work that state securities regulators are doing to empower entrepreneurs to understand their capital raising options and avoid compliance mistakes. Meanwhile, Congress would not increase resources for the federal government to fill the regulatory and boots-on-the-ground gaps created by preemption. At the same time, we believe there are proposals under discussion today that should be pursued. By way of example, NASAA endorses the Promoting Opportunities for Non-Traditional Capital Formation Act, which lawmakers noticed for today's hearing. This legislation would expand the functions of the Office of the Advocate for Small Business Capital Formation at the SEC and require meetings with state securities regulators at least annually. In addition, we endorse the legislation under discussion that would direct the SEC to revise their definition of accredited investor to exclude retirement accounts from the net worth calculation used to determine eligibility. At NASAA, we firmly believe that we all need to heed the lessons learned from the past Jobs Acts. Importantly, it would be a net negative for everyone to continue down a deregulatory path in which we further expand the private securities markets at the expense of the public markets. These private markets are rife with scams and frauds because of their lack of transparency. These frauds, or rather their consequences, typically affect not only the harmed investors, but also the hardworking Americans who hear about events like the FTX collapse and begin to question the wisdom of participating in our markets. As we heed these lessons learned, we need to refine the securities regulatory framework so that it better balances the needs of entrepreneurs and retail investors. I expect that we all agree that entrepreneurs are not automatically entitled to the hard-earned money of Americans. I expect that we also agree that retail investors are entitled to disclosure. In turn, we should all work together to refresh the regulatory framework in ways that better reflect these principles. In closing, I want to emphasize that we understand and share the same goals as the members of Congress who support robust public markets. State securities regulators want to continue helping entrepreneurs and small businesses. We also want to increase opportunities for investors and strengthen public markets. I look forward to answering your questions today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Lubin. We'll now turn to member questions, and the chair recognizes herself for 5 minutes for questioning. Mr. Trotter, last year, the U.S. IPO market reached one of its lowest points on record. In fact, the U.S. has recently recorded several of its worst years on record for IPOs, as the cost to go public has more than doubled since the 1990s. In addition, regulatory burdens on public companies, along with the ongoing compliance costs for publicly traded companies, are likely to continue to rise, especially if the SEC continues to finalize burdensome rules such as the climate rule. Mr. Trotter, as a leading member of the IPO task force and principal author of the IPO-related provisions of the Jobs Act, please explain how the policies in our capital formation package will help make our public markets more attractive.
Well, they will build on the success of the Jobs Act. They have all of the 4 ingredients that I outlined in my opening remarks. And it's critical to help for purposes of fostering IPO activity and making it easier to go public and encouraging job creation, to streamline the IPO process and to continue to build on the success of past legislative reform. So we've seen it helps a lot. You can put together a collection of small changes that have a big impact in combination, and you can approach the streamlining process using scaled disclosure, a balanced approach that cuts through the debate of more versus less. And you can do all that and make a meaningful impact in fostering IPO activity. So we need more of that. We've had a decade of 11 years of successful experience. It's time to build on that and do more.
Yes, and as you know, Mr. Trotter, SEC rules allow all issuers to test the waters with qualified institutional buyers and institutional accredited investors, either prior to or following the filing of a registration statement, to gauge potential interest in a contemplated registered security offering. Prior to the IPO, SEC staff reviews test the water materials to make sure that the information is consistent with the information presented in the company's registration statement. Would requiring issuers to include test the waters materials, such as slide decks, in their S-1 registration statement be unnecessary and potentially harmful to both investors and issuers?
It would be not only unnecessary, but a terrible step backward, and let me explain why. Testing the waters was implemented through Section 5D, and its power is in its simplicity. You can make it cuts through a problem, a communications restriction that made sense in 1933 and makes no sense in 2023. And that is, you need to be able to communicate with prospective investors about your potential IPO. And the investor protection that is included in 5D, which implemented testing the waters, is based on the audience. So communicate away as long as you're speaking with institutional accredited investors and qualified institutional buyers. And 163B recognized the success of that and expanded it to all issuers. if you destroy the simplicity of that by larding it up with additional requirements, it's going to, again, it's just going to be a step back.
My bill in our capital formation package, the encouraging public offerings, aims to simply codify the current SEC rules allowing issuers to test the waters prior to an IPO. And Mr. Trotter, would requiring these testing the waters materials to be filed as part of a company's registration statement represent a significant step backward, even if done in conjunction with codifying the current rules? Yes or no?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Ward, millions of investors rely on closed-end funds as an important source of retirement savings and for investment opportunities. However, the SEC's 15% limitation on a closed-end fund's investment in the private markets effectively denies retail investors access to the private markets. Given that closed-end funds are strictly regulated and professionally managed, do you think it is appropriate to limit their investment in the private market and exclude so many Americans from potential high-growth opportunities?
I think the closed-end funds are a very responsible way to give retail investors exposure to private assets. There's a lot of portfolio theory and modern financial theory on how much you should diversify a fund and investments across different asset classes. I think that should be the North Star of how we decide, how the individual fund managers decide how much to allocate into illiquid or private market assets on behalf of their investors as part of their fiduciary responsibility. It doesn't make sense to me that it would be a regulatory number that decides how to diversify a portfolio.
I thank you. I am out of time, and but I have so many more questions. I'll now turn to member questions, and I will recognize the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Sherman, for 5 minutes for questioning.
It's frustrating to see people get rich when they invest in just one thing and you wish it had been you. But keep in mind, I'd like to think I would have invested in Apple, but I might have invested in pear or in banana or in kumquat and lost all my money. Wages are too damn low. Most Americans are living close to paycheck. And frankly, people shouldn't be investing in private offerings until they have several months of living expenses in the bank. That being said, a system in which to be accredited investor means you're a millionaire. If you're not a millionaire, you can't invest is hard to defend, and I would not try. But keep in mind, the professionals who do this, the venture capitalists, say you're going to lose money on 9 out of every 10 investments and make it all back, hopefully, on the 10th. If you can't afford to lose money 9 out of 10 times, this may not be the market for you. If you're trying to raise money to run your business, you have a tendency to look at each element of investor protection as a barrier to you doing what you need to do for your business. But ultimately, if you don't have investor protection in the economy, you don't have investors. Investor protection is not the antithesis of capital formation. It is a necessary antecedent. Mr. Trotter, you've got a good point when you say that we ought to pass laws that become effective immediately. I think we should do that, but then we should give the SEC the right to make modifications by regulation. The chairwoman pointed out that there is a statistic that it now costs twice as much to go public as it did in the 1990s. But tomatoes are 5 times as expensive as they were in the 1990s. I don't know if that number is inflation adjusted. I do know that the biggest cost in going public is what you give the underwriter for selling the investment rather than the governmental costs. Does anybody know on an inflation-adjusted basis whether the cost to prepare, not the underwriter's fee, but the cost to prepare the going public document has more than doubled or has even gone up at all? I'm looking for a witness to raise their hand. I don't see one, so I'll invite you all to respond for the record and go on to another question. Once a company has, at least the way Congress wrote the law, once a company has 2,000 beneficial owners, it's a public company. And yet we have a circumstance where you can have hundreds of owners all use the same street name. I'm at Merrill Lynch. Merrill Lynch may have 500 of us who have invested in one company. It's listed as just one. That's kind of an absurd definition of private company if it has 5,000, 10,000 different beneficial owners. Now, when I say beneficial owner, I mean the entity. So like Mr. Smith's estate might have, he may have 8 children. I'm counting Mr. Smith's estate as one beneficial owner, even though there are 8 descendants who benefit. Ms. Lubin, does it make any sense to count each street name as just one beneficial owner? And can we have a more as a practical matter, make sure that street name listed securities ownership is, we identify how many beneficial owners there are?
Thank you for that question. I think you're exactly right. I think it's antithetical to the idea that you want public companies, but then if you just count the broker-dealer that lists the name, you can have thousands and thousands of shareholders underneath that, and you're only counting them as one shareholder.
I'd point out the SEC hasn't done its job in defining it, and even worse, some of my colleagues want to lock in and prohibit the SEC from changing how it counts. Ms. Lubin, does it make any sense to say you're an accredited investor just because you have $1 million net worth, and that if you don't have $1 million net worth, you're not accredited? And when I say $1 million net worth or $250,000 income, and I know there's some adjustments.
Thank you for that. The accredited investor definition is complicated, and it is being looked at by the SEC, and there are a lot of different standards. I think there are a lot of proposals on the table to take a look at it. The net worth, the income level, could an independent advisor help someone who has no conflicts? Are there possible...
My time has expired. I'll ask you to respond even in greater length for the record.
Okay, thank you. We'd be happy to do that.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, the chairman of the full Financial Services Committee, Mr. McHenry, for 5 minutes for questions.
I want to thank the chair for yielding and want to thank the panel for being here. You all have testified in different environments. Mr. Trotter, thank you for your work on the original Jobs Act in particular. And thank you all for your help in reviewing the legislation that's been put forward before this committee, some bipartisan, most bipartisan, and some that don't have full bipartisan support, but grateful for that. I want to continue the theme that the ranking member had with you, Mr. Sampson, about accredited investors. Right now we have income thresholds of net worth of over $1 million and very high income threshold for folks to be considered an accredited investor. And so my question for you is, do you think that that unfairly represents or fairly represents people's capacity to invest? And what are the economic impacts of that accredited investor standard and the limitations thereof?
Thank you for the question. Just because someone has the ability to generate $1 million, perhaps as an entertainer, as a professional football player, or even a professional, does not mean they have the sophistication to look at this asset class. Does not mean they have the sophistication to make a decision on understanding the risk outside of them perhaps being able to afford the risk. When you look at the lack of capital contextually that has gone to black founders in an asset class that's maybe 50 to 60 years old, but if you look at the last 20 years or so, less than 1% going to black founders in particular, the current framework is not working for all Americans. And so I know the devil may be in the details, and there may be some nuances to kind of reach bipartisanship, but we have to do something. And, I don't see a lot of legislation stopping folks, from buying Yeezys, flying to Vegas, and purchasing non-appreciating assets. Yet if, I want to invest in my fraternity brother, my soror, my classmate that I know, and I have some knowledge on the particular industry that this particular offering, may inure to. I think there should be an opportunity for them to invest. I mean, think about the professionals that come into entry-level careers, or even the gig workers or the suppliers who are contractors to those respective companies, and they work for 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, and they leave with a fake gold watch, never have been given the opportunity to actually invest $100, $500, or $1,000. Maybe there's a small equity package that they're given, but the multi-generational wealth creation is happening amongst the founders and the C-suite. And so if you really talk about democratizing access to wealth creation in the fourth industrial revolution, amending the definition to include people who may have been certified by some type of FINRA test or some type of institutional test is incredibly important, or have domain expertise in a respective supply chain, industry, and/or problem.
So Austin, Boston, Silicon Valley still are the disproportionate share of venture capital investment in this country. We have diverse founders that are being left behind, not because of any other reason than the statistics that are evident that we know this to be true. And this cannot simply be true that if you're born in the right zip code in America, you have better ideas than if you're born in the wrong zip code. That doesn't make a bit of sense. So everything we can do to make sure that we link capital with the best ideas in our economy is going to be a useful thing. We can protect consumers, absolutely, and we should. We should protect investors, but we should also give them the economic opportunity for the upside benefit as well. So, Mr. Sampson, thank you for speaking to that. Madam Chair, I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and Ranking Member. Again, I appreciate the opportunity. Now, this is a little odd for me because normally the way it works is when the Democrats are in charge, we've got the first 4 that testify basically saying what we believe, and then you got the Republican at the end basically saying what they believe. But since the Republicans are in charge now, normally you would have the first 4, basically stating the facts as the Republicans would believe, and then we'd have the Democrat at the end basically saying what we believe. However, I found very little to disagree with what was said with most of what everybody said. I mean, there were some discrepancies, and I do want to probe them a little bit, and I would state at the outset that I do believe in disclosures, and I especially believe that ESG disclosures are material. I do like where Gensler's going on that. I'll set that aside because that's one thing we just like to fight about up here. But Mr. Trotter, you said something that was very interesting. You said that you have these basic 4 facts or 4 issues that are important. Number 2, you said balanced approach to scale regulatory burden to the size of the company. I think that's what you said. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
That's correct. I did say that.
Okay. And I think that what Commissioner Lubin, I think what you said is, well, this is kind of taking us down the deregulatory path where we shouldn't go.
I did say that.
But there seems to be some logic in what Mr. Trotter said. It would seem to me that as the company is small, you wouldn't have to necessarily load it up with all of the burdens that you'd want to load up on a larger company. For example, we do that with the banks. Obviously, if a bank is significant and it's going to have systemic issues, we want to do stress tests that are very important to make sure that we don't have massive failures. But if it's a community bank, we don't require all of that. We allow them to exist, but we don't require all those regulations. I mean, there seems to be some logic to that. What do you think?
I think the issue here, and there are a lot of issues that we're trying to tackle, and a lot of these issues become conflated. So we've got very small businesses on the one hand that we're trying to take care of, the mom and pops, the pizza shops, the beauty salons, and things like that. And those are very small businesses that are taken care of very adequately under provisions that we all have in our statutes, and there are
Right.
some bills here that we don't like that are going to give them a totally...
Right, but let's move
Right.
forward. It's the ones that are ready to go up for the IPO.
Right, the bigger businesses, there are some really big businesses right now, really large companies that are sitting in this space where they don't have to go public because they're so comfortable in the private market where they really ought to be public companies. And they're the companies that everybody's lamenting. We don't have enough IPOs, we don't have big companies, and there isn't disclosure in the market. There isn't the information,
Right.
there aren't rules about the
So I think you're
auditors, there aren't
taking
rules
a
about
little-
third-party...
I'm going to interrupt you just for a second because I think you're taking it in a different direction that I was asking. I'm talking about companies that want to go to the IPO and want to be in the public side. That's what I'm asking about. Obviously, there's large, private companies that I think would benefit from going to IPO, but they don't because they're comfortable because they have, the backing that they need. Mr. Trotter, why don't you comment on this? I mean, it seems to me that, it would make some sense for the smaller companies that want to go into this IPO.
Absolutely, and I'll start with a comment that I've heard Ranking Member Sherman make in the past, which is you can't give 404B relief. You can't give relief from the Sarbanes-Oxley internal controls audit requirement because then you're going to have more WorldComs and Enrons. WorldCom and Enron were mega cap companies. WorldCom had $30 billion in revenue. Enron had reported $100 billion in revenue, $10 billion in revenue 4 years before it melted down, right? So they would never have qualified as an emerging growth company. And this is exactly the point. So they would be, if you had a time machine, and the Jobs Act existed prior, and Sarbanes-Oxley existed previously, they would have been, as mega cap companies, they would have to comply with the full panoply of regulation, exactly as you're describing, and a startup that is trying to enter public company status gets relief. And it's based on the original SEC rule says when you initially go public, even if you are a mega cap on day one, you get until your second annual report before you have to comply with 404B, even for the largest company. So the idea of the IPO on-ramp was, let's extend that. We did it for 5 years. It's time to extend it more.
My time is up, and I apologize because I had more questions, but thank you, and I yield.
I appreciate it. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizinga, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigation, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And at the risk of appearing like I'm picking a fight, which I'm not trying to, I can't let stand exactly what my friend from California seemed to be creating the image of. Because I can tell you back in February, we had a similar hearing on wealth creation and opportunity that specifically plumbed the depths of qualified investors. And we had a friend of mine, David Olivencia, who runs Angles Capital, Eli Velasquez, who was there, a woman here from Washington, D.C. named Omi Bell, who runs Black Girl Ventures. And we also had a Duke Law University professor who literally, after they went through the opportunities that they could have had and how they had been stymied, sat at the end of that panel saying, in effect, these people shouldn't be able to invest. And I got to tell you, way too often we've seen regulators, academics, and yes, politicians who have said, no need to apply. No need to apply because you're not wealthy enough, and we don't think you're sophisticated enough. And Mr. Sampson, I know you've been here, Mr. Trott, Mr. Ward, Mr. Brooks, I'm gonna ask you in the same good-natured way that I asked my friend David Olivencia this question. I hope you take it this way. Are you a sucker? Are you a dupe? Because I can tell you, based on your Twitter account, you're not. I looked you up. I retweeted you, by the way, because I know you're very excited about this. And hopefully my 30,000 followers will be able to commingle with your 30,000 followers and vice versa. But I can tell you, it's frustrating to me. It is frustrating to me when we have people saying, you know what? Nah, we're just not sure. We don't think you can really handle this. And, Mr. Ward, I know in your testimony, you said, I quote, investors often turn to their local communities for support to get their ideas off the ground. And that's interesting because in subcommittee hearing, that February hearing that we had, I noted of the 50-plus proposals from the Securities and Exchange Commission chair on his regulatory agenda, zero of his proposals focused on supporting capital formation. None of them, let alone updating the definition of accredited investors. And we were just having a chat up here, and there's rumors out there that they may even go the opposite direction. So I actually introduced the Accredited Investor Definition Review Act, which among other things would require the SEC to review the list of certifications, designations, credentials for individuals to qualify as an accredited investor. And Mr. Ward, real quickly, what is your definition of a sophisticated investor?
I look at a sophisticated investor as someone who has unique expertise or knowledge in the area they're investing in.
Okay. Mr. Sampson, do you believe that the SEC has overstepped their authority by basically telling investors what and where they can invest?
I don't know if I would go as far as to say they've overstepped it. I think, there's definitely...
Have they been have they fostered that?
I think about some of the titles, Title VII of the Jobs Act, which actually created Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Officer, and some of the outreach they've done to underrepresented communities. I think they've definitely tried. I've worked closely with the SEC, throughout my tenure. I did want to say something really quickly to the gentleman, and I've jokingly said this to Congressman McHenry over the years. We haven't agreed on much politically. Since I've been voting, since 1991, I was an undergraduate at New Orleans at Tulane University. David Duke was running. We got registered to vote so that David Duke wouldn't become governor. And so I voted Democrat all of my voting career. But when it comes to capital formations from the Jobs Act to redefining the definition of an accredited investor and some of the other regulatory frameworks, I have agreed with the GOP on that in specific.
To be honest, I'm not concerned about whether you're an R or a D, an independent, black, white, green. It doesn't really matter. It's about opportunity, freedom, and liberty. And way too often you're seeing government get in the way of that. And I'll finish with that. We don't want to see these rules hurt private companies seeking capital. And I just want to, and my time is up, and I blew up my whole plan on what I was going to do, but I just felt I couldn't let that stand. And I want to say thank you. Thank you for what you're doing, what you're fighting for, what you are standing for, because you are exactly the voices and the faces that we need to see, that the American people need to see, that frankly Chair Gensler needs to see, to make sure that we are going in the right direction. I yield back. Thank you.
And let the record reflect that Mr. Brooks was also applauding and giving a thumbs up. The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner, I'm curious about the type of population that is the accredited investor definition, rather, intended to capture. What group are we trying to capture? What segment of our population is the accredited investor definition intended to seduce?
Thank you for the question. Originally, when Reg D was set up back in the early 80s, less than 2% of the population qualified to be accredited investors. And the theory behind it was that investors who would be in a position to protect themselves, who had the wherewithal to lose the money if they were going to lose that investment money, would be putting their money into these private deals. Now the numbers, because they have not been adjusted for inflation, the only real change to it that had any meaning over the past 40 years was to take the primary residence out of that calculation. It now covers 13% of the population. And we're talking about, some of these proposals will expand it well beyond that, to a group when you think that most America, or a significant number of Americans only have $65,000 in their savings account, and that's all they have, will expose significant money to the riskiest investments in the market. So I understand that people should have freedom, but you don't get the phone calls I get on a regular basis. You don't see the arbitrations I see filed. You don't get the complaints we see where people are losing their money all the time, and this is their life savings that they're losing. People who do not have the ability to go in and re-earn the money that they've earned because they lose them in these kinds of investments. They're private deals, there's no backup, there's nobody else, there's no way for them to get their money back and replenish it. And the money's gone, the deals are gone, and they can't get it back. And the more these standards are liberalized, the more people are going to lose their money and not have the ability to get the money back. The problem with these deals are the more investors who get into them, they will not have any transparency. There's not going to be information. There's not going to be the ability to have a line of sight into the deals and see, what the financials are, what the background is, what's really going on inside those businesses, and have the ability. There are wonderful entrepreneurs. I saw the prior hearings. But there are also a lot of people out there who are interested in taking advantage of these investors.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to follow up. Apparently, I shouldn't say apparently. Do you believe that the existing thresholds are accomplishing that?
Over all my years in the Securities Division, I think the existing thresholds at this point need to be adjusted. I think things like pulling out savings accounts, adjusting the numbers up to reflect inflation is important. I think if you look at a lot of the bills that were noticed for this hearing, we're adjusting the numbers up for thresholds for the businesses and giving them more leeway. Some of the billion-dollar businesses are being adjusted for inflation so they continue to qualify for a lot of the standards and will continue to qualify. I think we should give the investors the same leeway and let their standards, give them the protections they'll get by adjusting their numbers the same way we're giving the businesses the benefit of being able to be bigger and still qualify for some of the breaks that they get.
So you believe that we should, that lowering these standards will somehow accomplish the objective?
Now, I think actually that we need to raise the standards for accredited investors so that they continue to have the protections that were originally intended. I think there are other things that we can do to maybe free up some of the requirements.
Do you have those ideas? My time is running out. So what do you have an idea on that? What we could do instead of lowering the threshold?
There are some other things that the SEC is considering that I think we can talk about, and we'd be happy to provide some additional information for you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Steil, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Trotter, if I can, you're one of the creators of the IPO on-ramp in Title I of the Jobs Act. And as Commissioner Peover noted last month, Title I is the most successful title in the Jobs Act and significantly increases IPO volume overall. Why, I have a handful of questions here, so if you can just be concise. Why should policymakers be interested in increasing the volume of IPOs?
Well, because it's directly linked to job creation. Over 90% of a company's job growth when it goes public occurs after the IPO.
Job creation in the United States of America. Title I created the emerging growth company construct, giving new and growing companies balanced regulation that scales over time. How should we quantify the cost savings that come with scaled EGC disclosures?
They're readily apparent to anybody who lives in the IPO ecosystem. So I hear a lot of criticism from academia. I hear criticism from lawyers who have never done an IPO. But for any IPO practitioner, it's readily apparent. It makes a big difference. So you don't have to present a third year of financial statements. You can go public with 2. That's a meaningful cost savings. You're not subject to SOX 404B. huge cost savings, at least $1 million a year.
So significant cost savings. You reference that people do have criticisms of this, claiming that it'll put investors at risk, all sorts of claims that we see out there. How do you respond to those criticisms?
Well, that is my point number 3 from my opening remarks. Every public company, including every EGC, including any company after all of the things that are being proposed right now, is subject to immense liability and compliance obligations. None of that changes. So that's why the doom and gloom is wrong, because all of the liability remains intact.
I agree. I think there's a lot of regulatory things that are still intact. EGC is a great on-ramp for companies to create jobs here in the United States of America. Would you agree that existing qualification thresholds for EGC status should be revisited, yes or no?
Absolutely, yes.
So I have a bill that addresses this. It would raise the EGC threshold so more companies can continue to benefit from the IPO on-ramp that you helped build. How would this overall impact startups in the United States if we revisited that threshold?
Your bill would be a game changer. I highly recommend it.
Thank you. Let me shift gears with you. I'm going to stay with you, though, if I can, Mr. Trotter. I have another bill, WIXI, well-known seasoned issuer status. Can you explain really quick the WIXI status, and in particular, the proposal to lower the public float threshold from 700 million to 75 million? The minimum companies would qualify for use of short-form registration. Would you support lowering the threshold from 700 to 75?
Yes, I do.
And why do you believe we should lower it to 75? Or maybe you have a different number, mine's 75. What would you do?
No, I applaud your number. That's actually in the 70s. The SEC said that's the number, that's the amount of float that gives you analyst following. And that was the basis of the well-known seasoned issuer definition. When the SEC proposed it in 2004, they actually proposed 300 million as a possibility back then, but when it was still an experiment. We've got 20 years almost of experience. It works. It's time.
And so then the follow-up question would be, some people would say, oh no, but it might not be safe. It might not be this. It might not be that. As you look at WIXI over the time that it's been available, is the construct, is it shown to be safe and effective over the last 2 decades of introduction?
Absolutely. It's a resounding success. All companies are required under Sarbanes-Oxley to be reviewed by the SEC at least on a 3-year basis. So all of the companies are having their filings reviewed.
And so is it safe to say that your view is we could go back, review and analyze these constructs in an ability to allow more companies to become public companies here in the United States? We have a sufficient and substantive regulatory framework to provide protection for investors. And if we take advantage of that opportunity, we'll actually be helping create jobs here in the United States of America.
Yes, 100%. Well said.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate all of our witnesses. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Nickel, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair Wagner. I'm very glad you're holding today's hearing on capital formation, as I share your goal of improving our markets and increasing access to capital for small businesses. One of my main priorities in Congress is ensuring equity and access to capital. According to a recent study, 6 in 10 Black entrepreneurs faced challenges in obtaining capital. When women and minorities can access capital for their small businesses, our entire economy benefits from it. Commissioner Lubin, what should Congress do to improve access, minority access to capital through our public markets?
Thank you for the question. I think there are a lot of things going on. I think I've listened to the prior hearings, and I think one of the things that I've heard a lot of VCs say and a lot of entrepreneurs say is that one of the things that happens is that the VCs and the entrepreneurs aren't seeing each other. I've heard a lot of discussions about what goes on the coast. You have to be in the right cities. And I think one of the things that we all could do together is do a better job of introducing people and getting them together. And one of the things that we were asked is what could we do as securities regulators, and I think expanding some of the projects we have of getting people to meet and to network and going into some of the programs and trying to set things up like having clinics where we have pro bono attorneys meeting up with entrepreneurs and getting some venture capitalists involved in it and having people meet each other, because what I've been told and what we've seen is that good businesses get funded and people just need to meet each other. So I think if we can facilitate that and get people meeting each other and talk to us some more, because they talk to us now about how do we get into compliance, and we can help them avoid some pitfalls and realize, because, for example, we've got some small business programs in Maryland where we say, look, you're probably not in a position where you want to take on shareholders right now, because there's a lot of things small businesses don't understand for that, but maybe you want to take on some debt and do debt offerings. So there's a lot that we do to help businesses develop things and do those kinds of programs.
Thank you. I applaud the efforts to enhance capital formation and remove roadblocks to ensure that entrepreneurs can access the resources they need to be successful. But at the same time, we need to ensure that consumers and new investors are adequately protected. Underrepresented entrepreneurs often struggle to find capital, and they would benefit from a larger pool of more diverse investors that look like them. Some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have proposed changing the requirements to qualify as an accredited investor. One example would be to include individuals who pass an exam established and administered by the SEC or FINRA. Mr. Sampson, you discussed in your testimony wanting to grow the pool of black investors in this ecosystem. Would this proposal to allow people to become an accredited investor after taking an exam do that?
It absolutely will. We created a Black Technology Ecosystem Investment Certificate Program during my visiting professorship at Kenan Flagler at the University of North Carolina in collaboration with Duke and Stanford, and the Links Incorporated, which is a national organization of affluent and many wealthy black women in this country. We graduated 50 people in that program that now understand the asset class, know how to identify deal flow, and know how to invest in venture funds and startups. We need to do that at the level of the thousands. Why? Because it's not that founders are not meeting investors. They're getting in the rooms and they're still getting told no. So the meetups are not working, the conferences are not working, and so we have to develop a new investor class that's educated to actually make investments in respective companies, and I think we'll see traction with increasing that less than 1% and getting it to more equitably around 13 to 20%.
Thank you, Mr. Sampson. You've identified some outstanding research universities there. Mr. Ward, what are your recommendations to ensure that such a test is as robust as possible?
If you're to do a knowledge-based testing into accreditation, I think the fastest path is through FINRA, where they already have a series of exams to test financial literacy. I think that's the first step. I think if you want to extend that, there's accreditation into different sectors. For example, a doctor might not pass the financial test, but may pass a sector-specific test. But I think the fastest path would be through FINRA registration exams that already exist.
Thank you so much for all the witnesses for joining us. Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. Garbarino, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you for holding this hearing. We got some great witnesses today. I want to touch on something I know the Chairwoman and Chair McHenry both spoke about. I got this text from a buddy of mine a couple weeks ago, and he said, it says, are you guys doing anything about that BS accredited investor rule? I'm shut out of investing in my 5,000 employee major company with a 1-to-1 investment match because I'm not worth enough money under the rule. I'm allowed to invest in highly risky penny stocks and Bitcoin, but not my own company. Such a dumb rule. Mr. Brooks, the current definition of accredited investor limits private markets investments to those deemed sophisticated. However, using wealth as the sole indicator of sophistication excludes a significant amount of potential investors who may possess other forms of knowledge, experience, expertise. Can you discuss your thoughts on expanding the definition to include other criteria?
Yeah, it's asinine. I mean, it's simply asinine that we're allowing this. And one of the most open secrets in Silicon Valley is these people just get money from their friends. So one of the 4th or 5th investors in Uber got a $25,000 friendly check to invest in Uber and ended up making tens of millions off of that. And is now one of the most well-known angel investors in the world, who's written the handbook on angel investing. But I couldn't, get a loan from that. I didn't have friends and family that could give me that. So it's an asinine rule. If we want to expand access, I mean, anybody. I guess if I were to step back for a second, when I started my company, I was living out of a Jeep Patriot that didn't have roll-up windows and didn't have locks in the car. And that was 7 years ago. I'm sitting here today because I don't want entrepreneurs and founders to go through that same thing that I had to go through. That struggle, the sacrifices that I've had to make to sit here today is asinine. If those accredited investor rules weren't in place, maybe I could have asked some, if I even knew what venture capital was, gotten some better things. What the SEC wants to do, it's an overstep of their power. Who am I to speak on that as Brandon Brooks with no college degree, and I'm not as fancy as everybody else here on this panel, but you know what? I've put in the work, and so I think I have a right to speak on this. What the SEC is doing, and others who want to heighten the accredited investor regulations, it's asinine, it's ASSA 10, it's ASSA 11.
I appreciate that, and if you actually have specific thoughts of what we should do, if you could respond in writing, I'd love it, but I want to, because there's a lot, but I do want to get to Mr. Ward, because I have a question about facilitating venture funding across the country. Mr. Ward, first-time fund managers and regional emerging managers drive capital beyond the traditional hubs. Can you explain why these entities are a crucial part of venture funding and what role they play in the startup ecosystem compared to larger funds located in the established venture hubs?
In this country, we're very good at producing accountants, lawyers, doctors. We're not so good at producing entrepreneurs. The best way we know how to do that is to activate these emerging managers, these angel networks that go out around the country and find entrepreneurial talent, cultivate that talent, and help them grow both through advice and through funding their companies. And so if we want to create more entrepreneurs in this country, it starts with creating more emerging managers and more angels that can go find these entrepreneurs and develop them.
What is Washington's role then in doing that and facilitating the increased capital access?
Anything Washington can do to lower the barriers of entry for these angel networks and emerging managers so that they can start aggregating capital to support these entrepreneurs, I would applaud. As we bring more and more angels into the heartland of America, you'll start to see these ecosystems pop up. We know that almost all startups start with an early seed funding from angels, not institutional capital. And so without those strong angel networks in regions, we can never graduate those companies into institutional capital and eventually public markets.
Appreciate that. And investment into other VC funds are currently classified as non-qualifying investments for the purposes of exemption from registration under the Advisors Act. If we were to include fund of funds investments as qualifying investments, would this help unlock capital that is otherwise competing for late-stage allocations?
It would dramatically increase capital into these sectors, in part because there would be more capital going to them. But these institutional investors use these investments in emerging managers to create the deal flow that goes into their larger investments. And that's how they find these early-stage entrepreneurs.
Thank you very much. I am out of time, so I'll yield back. Thank you, Chairman.
Gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Caston, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks so much to our chair. So I want to start just, I think I think you're probably seeing it up here. There's a bipartisan agreement that private markets are bigger than public markets right now, and that there is a concern about some risk of arbitrage and the opportunities that affords. I think where there might be a difference of opinion is whether that's necessarily a bad thing and what the causes are. I wouldn't argue as someone who ran private equity-backed companies. I didn't run private equity-backed companies because it was a compliance issue. There was just a lot of money, and over the 40 years ago, if you were managing the Harvard Endowment, you were in T-bills, right? And all of a sudden, there was this huge surge of institutional money that created opportunities to grow. And I think it would be disingenuous to say that somehow it's a surfeit of investor protection rules that made private equity markets grow. At the same time, the distinction between those matters, because in one case, investor protection is done through disclosures, in the other case, investor protection is done through these accreditation rules, and you can't lower one without increasing the need for the other, and we have to find some balance there. I guess my first question, and Mr. Ward, you and I talked before and appreciate your time. I just want to make sure that I had some of the facts right. Did I get right that you said that the private equity markets are about 6 times as big as venture capital markets in the U.S.?
That's what we think, yes.
Okay, so when we're talking about private markets, we are really talking about private equity right now. Mr. Trotter, I've never seen the analysis, but if you look at the ultimate owners of capital in private markets, not the private equity funds, pension funds, endowments, sovereign wealth funds, individuals, do you have any sense of what portion of that money is institutional and what portion is individual?
I cannot say that I do have any sense of that. There's been a lot studied in this area, the sort of de-retailization. I mean, there are, but I think Mr. Ward could speak to that.
Well, I guess if I could make just a qualitative observation, if I had, like, in my own experience raising money, there's a lot of institutional money out there. There's a very small number of sort of wealthy family offices. Like, yes, there are some, but my gut feeling, and I see heads nodding, but unless anybody disagrees, that the bulk of the money in private markets right now is institutional.
I think that would be fair, but I do think in the last decade we've seen the emergence of the family office that competes with institutional capital.
Sure. So then with that, someone once told me that the least sophisticated, in the way that you all are using the word sophisticated, not the way that we define sophisticated, the least sophisticated people in the world are pension fund managers. None of them trust themselves to actually do an analysis of a deal. They entrust their money to a venture capital fund, to a private equity fund, say, I want you to do the diligence, to sit on the board, to do the governance, to evaluate the deal, and essentially outsource that responsibility, right? So they're providing that investor protection in their fiduciary obligation, not because they're sophisticated in the Oxford English Dictionary sense, but because they are sophisticated in the legal sense and can afford to hire those people to do it. I say that because when we frame this as shouldn't we let more individuals in, I think we're missing the point that the investor protections that are there right now are to protect the institutional folks. And I guess either Mr. Trotter or Mr. Ward, however you want to answer this, how easy is it for someone who doesn't have the ability to get the phone call from Tiger Global Management Fund 4, would you like to be an LP in my next raise? How easy is it to look at a private equity deal and say, I know who is conflicted up and down the capital stack. I know who has step-in rights in this deal. I know who has governance provisions. How easy is it to find that out if you're not the size of a CalPERS or a Harvard Yale endowment?
I have a perspective on this, Congressman. I think it is difficult. I think all financial markets are led by institutional investors and followed by retail investors. That's true in the public markets, and that's true in the private markets.
So I'm close to the end of time, but I guess, Commissioner Lubin, I'd love to just give you the last word here. If private markets are dominated by institutional people who can afford to hire very sophisticated people to do their analysis on the back end, and if we are to make it easier for people who don't have that level of wealth to participate, who's going to win?
The investors, the retail investors who are on the ground to protect are going to lose. They always do.
And is it safe to say that the bills noticed at this hearing are primarily going to serve as a wealth transfer from those small individual investors to the big institutional players?
To them or to the scam artists?
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to our witnesses very much. I thank the chairman of the full committee and you, Chairwoman Wagner, for these 4 hearings on capital formation, as they are very important. These hearings are showing us that our capital markets have been clogged, and they could perhaps become more clogged with government regulations, and that's what we're here to figure out, real solutions that help all investors and all of our capital formation. So our committee is doing what we can do to fix these problems. We're here to talk about what we can get done, and we appreciate the feedback being received. So, Mr. Trotter, as you know, the sale of securities is regulated both on the federal and state levels, where there have been efforts to provide greater clarity and uniformity between federal and state laws by providing exemptions from certain state levels or state-level blue sky laws. Federal and state security regulation remains burdensome and, in fact, considered a patchwork system. Can you explain some of the challenges companies face when forced to navigate burdensome patchwork system of state and federal securities regulations?
Well, you summed it up nicely when you just described the list. I mean, and you're just getting started there. So the compliance obligations, even after you chip away in these small ways that are being proposed, are still onerous. But what we're proposing, or what we proposed it with the IPO task force, is scale the regulation. And we have discussed this already, but it's not about more versus less regulation so much as balancing the regulation so that it scales to the size of the company that is regulated. If you're a mega cap, all of the rules apply to you, and there are going to be more rules every year as we go forward, right? If, however, you're a company that's trying to enter the public company system, you should be encouraged, not discouraged. And you can do that through scaled disclosure, through the on-ramp type of concept. And we have 11 years of successful experience with the Jobs Act and emerging growth companies. We have almost 20 years of successful experience with well-known seasoned issuers. Those are both categories that should be expanded significantly.
All right, thank you. Secondary market transactions take place on exchange or off exchange. Some states have laws that limit off exchange secondary trading in securities. Can you explain how this approach interferes with capital formation without promoting investor protections?
I'm sorry, can you
You know what? Let's move on. I want to get to some other questions. That's it's in regard to a bill, HR 2506, Restoring of Secondary Trading Markets Act, that I'm introducing that would prevent state laws from limiting off-exchange secondary trading in securities of an issuer that makes current information publicly available. So it's just a bill that I'd like to get your and the panel's feedback on.
I'd be happy to look at that and follow up.
Great, thank you. Mr. Trotter, staying with you, the House passed the Jobs Act, as you well know, in 2012. At the time, the North American Securities Administrators Association released a statement saying that the Jobs Act sacrifices essential investor protections without offering any prospects for meaningful, sustainable job growth. Were these predictions correct?
They were 100% false.
Right. So in your view, has there been weakening of investor protections or an increase in fraud that since the Job Act was passed?
No, because the liability provisions of the federal securities laws remained unchanged from the Jobs Act, as well as all of the provisions that you're looking at today.
Okay, all right, I appreciate that. Obviously, access to capital is very vital. Mr. Brooks, I'm interested in you. You're making some faces over there, and there's a lot of emotion and feelings going on. Tell us some of your thoughts of the questions and some of the answers from both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, I guess overall, I'm just, I think it's really interesting to see who's stayed, who's left. Just from my point of view sitting here, I think it's really interesting hearing the questions and just who's put in the work to understand the struggle of being a black founder, to talk with real black founders, to talk with real women founders, to talk with real Latino founders, those that exist outside the lines. I don't know a single one that I've talked with or myself that would not agree with what we're trying to do here today, expanding access to more people that look like me and unfortunately many of the people that have left the room today.
Well, I look forward to keeping the conversation going with you. I appreciate you being here, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
How about Latinos? No one talks to Latinos.
He said the Latinos, too. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Brooks, couldn't agree more with your comments. In 2020, the SEC adopted amendments to Reg D to allow for certain demo day communications to be exempt from being considered general solicitation or general advertising. The amendment also defined angel investor group for the purpose of federal securities laws. These changes were made to support startups discussing their products and business plans, demo day events, without it being considered an investment offering. Given that Reg D reform is on the SEC's Reg Flex agenda, and Democrat commissioners expressed their intention to chill private offerings, how critical are these changes made in 2020 to capital formation, and should Congress solidify these changes by codifying them into law?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a no-brainer because it makes it easier for people that exist outside the lines to get it in front of people without getting expensive attorneys and people involved. I mean, just if you have $10 in your bank account, how are you going to pay an attorney a couple thousand just to prove that you can present on demo day so you can raise money? It's crazy.
Right. Thank you. Mr. Ward, as you know, Regulation A enables companies to sell securities to the public with limited disclosure requirements compared to public companies. Despite its potential benefits, Regulation A still seems to be underutilized. How would amendments to Regulation A help small businesses raise capital?
I think Reg A, and I'll also include Regulation CF, are two great ways for companies to start their journey of raising initial capital. The two things I worry about in Reg A and Reg CF is creating two paths for companies, a Reg D path and a Reg A path. I think it creates issues around adverse selection bias and picking which path they should take. What I'd be supportive of is a way to merge Reg CF, Reg A with Reg D, so that Reg CF, Reg A could be a way to jumpstart companies in their local communities to raise their initial seed capital, and then they move on to Reg D status to start raising more institutional capital over time.
Would companies benefit from Regulation A if Congress raised the offering cap?
I think companies may benefit from that. I think it will benefit the larger, higher scale companies, but I still think there needs to be a path to Reg D. The amount of money most companies need these days to get to an IPO far exceed the current Reg A limits.
Appreciate that. Mr. Ward, there's currently no suitable regulatory framework for finders who, incidental to their primary business, help match potential investors with private issuers and receive payment for successful introductions. Today, finders are treated as broker-dealers due to the mishmash of SEC staff interpretations and no action letters. Is this a problematic framework for those seeking to make connections between investors and private companies seeking capital?
I think so. Today, the way that finders work in practice to circumvent the broker-dealer rule is they're usually anointed as advisors and given equity in the company to help the company. It's unclear if advisors will be a big part of the ecosystem. I think we're still learning about what role intermediaries have in the venture ecosystem and how to connect founders to investors.
Would exempting finders from broker-dealer registration eliminate ambiguity about when companies can engage finders who are not registered as broker-dealers? And would this help facilitate small business capital formation?
Yes, I think much like when we liberalized investment banking licenses to help founders sell their companies, I think if we can exempt finders from broker-dealer registration to seed an ecosystem of finders to help founders find capital, I think that could catalyze a much more liquid market for financings.
Thank you. In the time I have left, Mr. Trotter, during the passage of the Jobs Act, you were a leading member of the IPO task force and served as a principal author of the IPO-related provisions. Can you compare today's kind of political and economic climate to when that passed a little over a decade ago?
Well, there's one comparison that's clear to me. And again, you have this debate over more versus less regulation, and you know where that ends. It ends in stalemate. But my answer to that is follow the path that the Jobs Act took in Title I, the IPO on-ramp provisions. It's not about more versus less. It's about scaling the regulation. It's about balanced regulation so that the full suite of regulations apply to the largest enterprises and the new companies that are entering the public company system get a break. It's worked for 11 years very successfully.
Gentleman's time's expired.
Agree. Thank you.
It's time for more.
Gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Nunn, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
First, Chairman Wagner, thank you very much for calling this committee specifically to build upon the important goals of bolstering our private markets, expanding accredited investments, and encouraging investments in small businesses throughout the country. I want to thank each of you on the panel who took time out of what I know is a very busy daily life to come and do what is on no one's bucket list, testify before Congress. So compliments to each of you, and for the family members who are here present, thank you for supporting your family in this. Look, you all have very, very incredible stories to share, and it's truly, I think, a lot of Cinderella stories that have been made successful. Mr. Ward, I'm going to focus in on you. Look, you had to leave your hometown, to go to California, to network, to find angel investors. You went through this process over a decade ago, and the challenge is that, you know, great ideas and American dreams, as Mr. Brooks said earlier, happen all across this country. But you were forced to find capital in those very select markets, specifically, as we've identified in this committee, in basically 3 states, Massachusetts, New York, and California. And there's a lot more out there and a lot greater potential. So I'd like to point out, in my home state of Iowa, and a number of us represent smaller states on this, just for the rest of the world watching this, 33,000 new small businesses were started in Iowa alone last year. And they did it without the benefit of being in Silicon Valley. Now imagine for a second what this entire country might look like if we were discussing what is capable this afternoon and we built upon the Jobs Act of 2012 just a decade later. So, Mr. Ward, share with us, first of all, just that story for you, how you got to California and really what that meant for what you left behind.
So I arrived in California in 2010, didn't know anybody, didn't have a job, was brought there for family reasons, decided to start a company as one does if you move to Silicon Valley against your will. And part of that process was trying to meet other founders, trying to meet other investors. The rule back then, which hasn't changed today, is if you want to get an investor, you have to find an introduction to an investor, you have to meet that investor personally, and it was months and months of just networking and finding people. That hasn't changed today. If you're someone who's not in California in the thick of it, it's extremely hard to do. If you're in Iowa, it might even be impossible. I think the path to creating an on-ramp for founders in different geographies and regions is to create strong, robust emerging managers and angel networks in those regions. And we're starting to see this happen in different hubs like Nashville, Austin, Texas, Atlanta, Georgia, and there's no reason why we can't do that in places like Iowa as well.
So let me ask then, you've seen this landscape change dramatically just in the last decade. What other opportunities are there for new and emerging businesses to be able to tap into those markets without having to move to the place where the network already exists? How do we expand that network out there, and what kind of things can we be doing on this panel?
Yeah, I think expanding accredited investor rules will help a lot. For example, in Iowa, an accredited investor rule is different than, it's the same rule but has different impact in Iowa than in California. So I think creating those angel networks by lowering the barriers for access to capital, lowering barriers for angel investors who want to graduate into running their own committed funds, I think will help as well. I think one of the things that we forget is all investors are entrepreneurs also. They start their own funds, and so anything we can do to help those entrepreneurs build their businesses, which is to invest in other entrepreneurs, has a flywheel effect on the ecosystem.
Mr. Ward, couldn't agree with you more, and compliments what you've done with Carta in such a short time. Mr. Brooks, I would like to return to you here on this idea of really expanding the American dream. I think one of the things that we underappreciate is just how many dreams are out there that have yet to be fulfilled. Perhaps you could give us just a little bit of perspective as a father of 5 daughters, one who's biracial. How have you guys managed this, and what are we leaving off the table that we could really grow?
Just more access, more opportunities, and it's really so simple. I mean, it's a fantastic place to be. It was on my bucket list, so I'm crossing that off today. Thank you. But it's so simple, and it's creating more opportunities. That's it. This expanding accredited investors creates more opportunities for people to invest. Yeah, you're going to get some wrong, but guess what? I can go to the craps table and hop the yo as many times as I want, but I can't sit here and invest in a great company that my friend is starting that I know will be fantastic, but the rich, wealthy, elite class, white male mostly, that lives in Silicon Valley can go and invest in my friend and become a multi-billionaire maybe because of it, while I sit here in the same position.
Thank you, Mr. Brooks. I'd say always bet on the heartland. You may find itself very surprised. With that, I yield my time.
Hear, hear, says a gentlewoman from Missouri. Now, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions, for 5 minutes.
Madam Chairman, thank you very much. And let me say, as our colleague, Mr. Vargas, said, thank you for having not only a subcommittee hearing that is seemingly bipartisan, but also for your leadership, Mr. Vargas, for taking time to stick around to hear all of this great information. It proves in about how we do need a better roadmap for this integrity. I would like to ask you all, because I have been working with the SEC. We've spent a lot of time in here worrying about rules, regulations, investor rules, all those kinds of things. But I find that the Securities and Exchange Commission is a huge hindrance to the effectiveness of IPOs becoming capable of what they want to do. I engaged the chairman and the entire SEC last year, found them that they were asleep at the switch, did not come to work, gave conflicting information to the investor, weren't willing to stand behind it, and then held it against the investor when their own lawyers were quoted to the department. The SEC chairman point blank told me that he was not going to respond back to a request that was made by an IPO investor when they intentionally provided all of the information that they thought they needed to provide, and were 7 or 8 months later said, no, we're not going to even respond back. We won't respond back to you, and we're not going to respond back to them. Tell me about the SEC as being a hindrance to effectively people building this wealth and wealth creation off IPOs because of their oversight, blunders, and inattention to capital formation. Anyone? Okay, well, I guess I'll continue on then, since no one has any direct information. I find that we need, as I spoke to the chairman about yesterday, a process whereby the SEC would be able to recognize that they are not being forthright about solving problems, that when investors have problems as they move forward, if you can get in trouble, you ought to be able to get out of trouble. But simply to have information becomes because someone makes a claim against you and not even sharing that information with an investor group or a group of people to where they can resolve that, but waiting months and months, maybe up to a year, perhaps more, when they have contracts, when they have agreements, when they're trying to put together a company as they're going through their formation, whether it be in the stock market or in NASDAQ. I find that disturbing, and I told a story yesterday to the chairman that I said, I remember when my dad became the FBI director for President Reagan, that the Department of Justice tended to have a viewpoint that they would not discuss any part of the work that they did, even after an indictment, with even proper counsel. And he changed that. He decided that proper counsel that does exist in this company, lawyers who were beholden to a bar, to a court that could, for any ethical challenges or mismanagement or things that took place where they did not properly take that information and work for resolution, could be held by a court. I believe that we should have a better process at the SEC where anyone that has a problem where the SEC begins an investigation, that there should be legal counsel that could be brought in on behalf of this IPO or anybody that is where there's this recognition to resolve matters, not to wait a year and delay them and last them out. I find it obnoxious. I think it's unprofessional. And I believe it is an intentional effort that is being made by the SEC to bludgeon investors in this country. Madam Chairman, I heard no response, but I will yield back my time.
The gentlewoman from Indiana, Mrs. Houchin, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Wagner and Ranking Member Sherman, and thank you to the witnesses for coming to speak with us today. Mr. Brooks, you certainly seem happy to be here. That is refreshing. Among the greatest strengths of the American economy are our public markets and the ability for retail investors to buy shares in companies they support. By expanding access to our public markets for companies, Americans across the country, including Southern Indiana, can build wealth and encourage economic growth. In recent years, however, companies have been pushed away from public markets, and often businesses find that the reasons against pursuing an IPO outweigh the benefits of going public. Mr. Trotter, the raw numbers of IPOs has declined significantly in recent years, with the U.S. experiencing some of its worst years on record in 2016 and again in 2022. Recent reports indicate the downward trend in IPOs will continue into 2023. Could you please explain the factors contributing to such a steep decline in the number of IPOs and what that means for everyday investors?
Well, when a company that's backed by early stage investors reaches the point where it's ready to go to the next level and return capital to those early stage investors, it has a choice. It can find a buyer and sell the company and become an acquisition target, or it can be it can follow an IPO, pursue an IPO, and become a new public company. And those are very different paths. And with the public markets less hospitable to private companies, they're going to be more likely to follow the M&A path. Now, the company should do what makes sense for the company. But if you've tilted the balance away from IPOs and toward an M&A exit scenario, then you're going to see fewer IPOs. So the IPO on-ramp was an effort to readjust that balance. We've had a decade plus of successful experience. You've seen the positive impact that it can make. And I've said it a couple times already, but I don't tire of saying it. It's time to expand that category of emerging growth companies.
Thank you. With fewer IPOs and a shrinking number of companies on public markets, not only do local businesses have fewer options to raise capital, but retail investors have fewer opportunities to build wealth and secure their futures. Mr. Ward, Regulation A enables companies to sell securities to the public with limited disclosure requirements compared to public companies. Despite its potential benefits, Regulation A seems to be underutilized. How would amendments to Regulation A help small businesses raise capital? Would more companies benefit from Regulation A if Congress raised the offering cap?
I think raising the offering cap and anything we can do to make Reg A more attractive would be helpful to founders. I do think there's a concern around having a two-track system for capital formation in the private markets. The most successful regulation framework we have today is Reg D, and I'm strongly encourage all of us to look at is there a way that we can use Reg A and other capital formation regulations like crowdfunding and marry them with what's working in Reg D?
That's great, thank you. Just earlier this week, I introduced my first bill in Congress, the Regulation A Plus Improvement Act. It would raise the cap for Regulation A and allow more small to mid-sized companies to sell securities on public markets. As a member of this committee, I am committed to cutting red tape to make it easier for local businesses to grow, while also expanding opportunities for everyday investors to build wealth to secure their financial futures. I look forward to continuing to work on this issue with this subcommittee. I thank the chairwoman, and I yield back.
I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for their testimony today. I'd also like to take a moment to invite any of our witnesses that have family members, not staff, but family members with them to recognize them. Mr. Sampson?
Sure, thank you for that. Joining me today is my wife of nearly 25 years, Shanteria Austin Sampson.
Mm-hmm.
She's also my partner in business and investing
Yes.
as well. My oldest son is here today. Rodney Sampson II. He's a recent graduate of Morehouse College and is headed to Georgia Tech to work on his graduate degree in computer science, and he's a Phi Beta Kappa.
Congratulations.
Rodney III, you're going to see a trend here. Rodney III is a junior at Morehouse College as well, and just secured his first summer internship at Harvard Business Publishing.
Wonderful.
Rodney IV just turned 17 and is a freshman at Marsh Brown College as well. He's also a software engineer and a gamer as well, so we're really excited about him.
Good.
Rodney V is here as well. And of course, we have Sophia, our youngest.
At last, thank heavens.
Oh, our oldest daughter couldn't make it. She's a graduate of Spelman, Phi Beta Kappa, is working on her PhD at UPenn in computer science.
Wow. Congratulations to
Thank
you and your wonderful family, and to your wonderful wife, who's also partnering with you in business. It's heartwarming to see. So thank you. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. This hearing is now adjourned.